Welcome to the online program series from Adams County Historical Society. My name is Antigone Ladd, and I'm delighted to be a host for this program, and I invite your suggestions for future programs. Our speaker tonight is Adam Schefts, a man who has a lifelong fascination not with the military side of history, but with the culture, with the customs, with the superstitions of people, particularly in the Victorian and Edwardian eras. Adam has done some amazing research. I am particularly fascinated by his motion picture history, where he has delved back to the earliest motion pictures that were ever created. And you will see some amusing ones, some serious ones, and you'll see some surprising ones of events that we didn't know had been captured on film. He also has dug into early photography and some of the customs that affected that photography. And I think you'll laugh at some of them because he's collected the bizarre, the strange, the amusing. But the collection itself is fascinating because it talks about a period of history that we do not delve into from the civilian side. So I'm going to turn the program over to Adam Schefts by asking him how he became fascinated with this particular period of history. Adam?
I can't put my finger on a specific time, but I know it dates back to when I was very young. I've always been drawn to older things. I used to have models of cars from the early 1900s. I always liked cars from that period better than the modern cars or even cars from the 60s or 70s. I was always drawn to the very early 1900s cars. Even with when I was into baseball for a short while, I would collect some baseball memorabilia. It was always 19th century, very early 20th century baseball memorabilia. No matter what my interest seems to have been throughout my life, it's always been dating to the 19th or early 20th century. And that carried over into this program. In terms of history, regarding history itself, I've always been drawn toward the weird, the strange, obscure, much more so than textbook history. So when I started this program in 2019, the Victorian and Edwardian program, I just took my love of history and my love of the strange and unusual and put it together in this program.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. The 19th and early 20th centuries were very significant times in American history. The 19th century saw a war which divided the nation in two. It saw the birth of recorded film and sound. The early 20th century saw the prominent emergence of flight and automobiles. But that's just surface history. If you dig deep, deep down, there is a plethora of fascinating and strange facts and information to come out of these time periods. And that's what I'm going to share with you today. In chronological order, you are going to witness the strange, odd, obscure, even comical parts of American history. So let's jump right into it. There's a lot to cover. There's a certain terminology on social media some of you may be familiar with. It's called a selfie. This is considered the first selfie ever taken. It's from 1839, and the man in this photo is Robert Cornelius. He was an amateur chemist and photography enthusiast from Philadelphia. His family owned a shop there. One day in 1839, Robert Cornelius went to the back of his family's shop, set up his camera, removed the lens cap, stood in frame for a 1-minute exposure of himself, resulting in his image. Now this also happens to be the very first photographic portrait ever taken, whereas prior to this, portraits were painted. So a little bit of photography trivia. The very first photographic portrait happened to be a selfie. Now I was able to find some early selfies. This one on the left is from 1900. The one on the right is from 1901. And these were taken with a Kodak Brownie camera, which cost about $2 at the time, which is roughly about $60 today. Now when I say historic shipwreck, one thing that usually comes to mind, or most often comes to mind, is Titanic. And Titanic is in this program, but as this program goes in chronological order, it's later on. This is a very historic shipwreck, but largely forgotten by today's standards. This is the SS Arctic. The SS Arctic was one of the largest passenger steamships when it first launched in 1850. It was known for both its speed and luxury. While traveling from Liverpool to New York on a September morning in 1854, the Arctic struck a smaller French steamship. Neither crew from either ship noticed the other until after it was too late. It was a very foggy morning. The Arctic struck the smaller French steamship and took on water. And in doing so, the Arctic sank 4 hours later. It's unknown what happened to the smaller French steamship. Now, with passenger and crew combined aboard the Arctic, there were 400 on board. However, the lifeboat capacity was only for about 180. In the panic to get the lifeboats, the principle of women and children first was completely ignored. Men pushed women and children aside to get to lifeboats first. Of the 400 on board the Arctic, only 88 survived. All 88 survivors were men. Of those 88 surviving men, 61 of them were crew members. And that goes to show, as soon as there was a threat of that ship sinking, that crew was out of there. It was everyone for themselves. Now, this made national news, but no investigation was ever conducted, and no one was ever held responsible for this disaster. The public saw the action of letting all women and children die so disgraceful. Some of the 61 surviving crew members, both out of shame and fear for their own safety, fled the United States, taking up residence in other countries. When you visualize Abraham Lincoln's face, one feature of his face that comes to mind is his beard. Did you know he had no intention of growing a beard, but it was because of a little girl's letter that he grew one? On October 15, 1860, 11-year-old Grace Bedell from Westfield, New York, wrote Lincoln a letter after she saw a picture of him during his campaign. The letter basically stated he would look so much better with a beard because his face is so thin. Lincoln wrote back to Grace a few days later, making no promises, saying he's never worn a beard. Wouldn't it appear silly to begin wearing one now? Well, to the photos we go. The first photo of Lincoln you see, it was taken August 13, 1860. This is about 2 months prior to receiving Grace's letter. It's also the last photo of Lincoln without a beard. The second photo was taken November 25, 1860. This is about a month after receiving Grace's letter, and as you can see, he's starting to grow a little bit of a beard. And this final photo was taken February 9, 1861, and he's got his beard. Now, 10 days after this last photo was taken, Lincoln, on his way from his home state of Illinois to Washington, D.C., his train stopped in Westfield, New York, the home of Grace Bedell. Lincoln got off the train and spoke with the townspeople about how a little girl from that town was responsible for him growing his beard and how he'd like to thank her if she were present. Sure enough, she was. Her father brought her over to Lincoln, and the two talked for a few minutes before Lincoln had to go on his way. So the saying, one person can make a difference, is true. This little girl's letter to Lincoln resulted in him growing his trademark beard we all recognize today. Now, there's no photo available of Grace from when she was 11 and wrote Lincoln this letter, but we do have a photo available of her from her teenage years. What happens when one conjoined twin is drafted to fight a war and not the other? You may recognize these two, the famous conjoined twins Chang and Eng, who toured for a while with P.T. Barnum. By 1865, the brothers had retired from the sideshow business. They were now living in Mount Airy, North Carolina, when the Union pushed its way into North Carolina, stopping in Mount Airy. While there, they decided to hold a draft, drafting eligible men over the age of 18 to join their army. Now, I imagine this draft wasn't very popular. Keep in mind, this is the Union Army drafting Confederate supporters. Now, the way the draft worked were names of eligible men were written on pieces of paper. The names were stuck in a lottery wheel. The wheel was spun. Names were chosen at random. Eng's name was chosen. Chang's was not. Those orchestrating the lottery didn't know what was occurring until the lottery was complete. And then they realized, oh boy, we have a problem. They couldn't physically separate the brothers. They couldn't have Chang fight. He wasn't drafted. So they were left with one option only, and that was to release Eng from having to serve, and that's exactly what happened. Neither brother saw any action during the Civil War. It's one of those fact is stranger than fiction stories to come out of the war. To those of you familiar with texting and emojis, this represents the winky face. When did the winky face first appear, and was it by accident? On August 7, 1862, the New York Times printed a transcript of a speech by Abraham Lincoln. In it looks to be what appears like a winky face. Now notice where the winky face appears after the words applause and laughter. There are three theories today as to why that is there and what it could possibly mean. Historians have these theories, but because they can't agree on what it is and why it's there, how can we? So I'm going to present these three theories to you and let you decide. There is no right or wrong answer. Theory number one. The typesetter added the winky face to embellish the audience's reaction of applause and laughter. Theory number two. It was a typo. The semicolon shouldn't have been there. Theory three. It was just grammar characteristics of the time period. Now, no matter what theory you tend to lean toward, the only person who knows exactly what this is and why it's there is the typesetter himself, and he's been gone a very long time. So, unfortunately, we will never know what this winky face is and why it's there. Is it ever too late to make an apology? As you will see, no, it is not. On November 19, 1863, Abraham Lincoln arrived at Gettysburg to deliver the Gettysburg Address. One newspaper on hand to document this occasion was the Patriot and Union. Whoever the journalist was on this day for the Patriot and Union did not think very highly of Mr. Lincoln's address and wrote a rather trashing review of it in the November 24, 1863 edition of this publication. And that review goes: "We pass over the silly remarks of the President. For the credit of the nation, we are willing that the veil of oblivion shall be dropped over them, and that they shall be no more repeated or thought of." Fast forward 150 years. The Patriot and Union, now called the Patriot News, is going through their archive in search of original content to reprint for the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg and the Gettysburg Address when they come across this trashing review. The editors feel they need to right this wrong, so they issue their own public apology, and that apology begins: 70 years ago, the forefathers of this media institution brought forth to its audience a judgment so flawed, so tainted by hubris, so lacking in the perspective history would bring, that it cannot remain unaddressed in our archives. The apology then takes on a more sincere approach. In the editorial about President Abraham Lincoln's speech delivered November 19, 1863 in Gettysburg, the Patriot and Union failed to recognize its momentous importance, timeless eloquence, and lasting significance. The Patriot News regrets the error. So as you can see, it is never too late to issue an apology, as witnessed here 150 years later. Here are a couple of early Halloween superstitions. Now, these superstitions are what are referred to as love tests, and these were practiced by women who were single on Halloween Eve in hopes of finding love. Love test number one. On Halloween Eve, before midnight, a woman was to look in a mirror, or a looking glass as it was called most often at the time, where she should see the reflection of a man appear next to her. That man represents her future husband. If she sees his reflection appear next to her, she will soon actually meet that man and be married. Now, there is a variation to this love test, in which a woman would take a handheld mirror. She'd go up to the top floor of her house. If there was an attic, she'd go up to the attic. Then, looking at herself in the handheld mirror the entire time, she is to descend every stair in the home backwards, where, by the time she gets to the last basement step, according to the love test, she should have seen the reflection of a man appear next to her, and if so, she will soon actually meet that man and be married if she first didn't fall and break her neck. Now, there's another love test. This one was practiced by 2 or more women, all of whom were single. So this was a single women's group activity on Halloween Eve. On Halloween Eve, before midnight, women are to boil an egg, 1 egg per woman. Now follow me on this, it gets interesting. When the egg is boiled, the yolk is removed, and the empty egg is filled with salt, right to the top. At exactly midnight, the women are to eat the salt-filled egg without anything to drink. Now, immediately after consuming the salt-filled egg, the women are to go right to bed, where, because they're going to be thirsty, they're supposed to dream of a man bringing them a glass of water. The man in their dream represents their future husband. If they accept the glass of water from the man in their dream, they will soon actually meet that man and be married. If they refuse the glass of water from the man in their dream, they will not meet that man, and chances will likely be higher of them never getting married. So, a couple of early Halloween superstitions that remained popular from the mid-19th century up through the early 20th century. Speaking of Halloween, one thing which was popular during that time, and even during Christmas, were games. One game in particular came into fashion in the mid-19th century, simply called Apple and Candle. Now, the way this game worked was an apple was suspended from a light fixture by a string, which was tied around the stem, and a candle was stuck into the side of the apple. The candle was lit, and the apple was pushed and spun, so it wasn't just swinging, but also rotating rapidly. The object of this game was for everyone to take turns trying to catch the apple in their mouth, without getting burned in the process. As you can imagine, this was not the safest game to play, and it was not uncommon for people to miss biting the apple, instead bite the candle, burning their mouth, burning their face, lighting their hair on fire, or whatever else may occur when playing with fire. This game, Apple and Candle, appeared in game books of the 19th century, but there were so many injuries as a result of playing it that when this game was introduced in game books of the early 20th century, it was then intended to remove the candle, replace it with a packet of flour, so instead of biting down on a candle and burning yourself, now you can just potentially be hit in the face with flour and covered in flour, depending on how many times you're hit. So, a little safer, but possibly a bit messier as well. The beauty industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's not going anywhere anytime soon, and this was no different in the 19th century. Maybe not billions, but certainly millions of dollars. One beauty product which became available for sale in the mid-19th century were arsenic wafers. Now, many people today would consider having a tan attractive. However, in the mid-19th century, having very light, almost porcelain-like skin was considered attractive by women's beauty standards of the time. Women would consume these arsenic wafers, and the arsenic in them would kill the red blood cells in the body, giving that appearance of that porcelain-like skin that was so desired at the time. Doctors said there was such little arsenic in each wafer that it wouldn't harm anyone, but women were harmed. Some died. The number of women who died from arsenic wafers is unknown, but there were deaths. As medical advancements were being made in the late 19th, early 20th century, it was then realized arsenic is not safe to consume in any amount, and arsenic wafers were taken out of stores, out of catalogs, no longer available for sale. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard the expression, died of a broken heart. This was a popular expression during the 19th century, especially pertaining to women who had lost their husbands. Depending on how long a couple had been married, a woman was expected to be in a period of mourning anywhere from a month to a few months to a year, or really 2.5 years was the maximum amount of time a woman was expected to be in a period of mourning. Now, however long a woman was in mourning for, she would wear a mourning gown. Some of these mourning gowns, not all of them, but some of them contained arsenic, and that was used to obtain a certain shade of black. Now, these women would wear these arsenic gowns out in public, and they would be seen out in public often. And those who saw them often enough would notice over time that they're looking rather frail, rather sickly. And they may be thinking to themselves, poor thing, she's dying of a broken heart. No, she's not dying of a broken heart. She's dying because her mourning gown is slowly killing her. The arsenic from the gown was seeping into her pores, getting into her bloodstream, slowly poisoning her. But again, arsenic wasn't very well understood at this time. It wasn't again until the late 19th, early 20th century when it was realized arsenic is not safe to consume, not safe to wear, and this ingredient was removed from mourning gowns, and miraculously, women stopped appearing to be dying of a broken heart. Many of you may not like being woken by an alarm clock every weekday morning or weekend. And if you don't like alarm clocks already, you certainly wouldn't like this one. The patent that you see here is for an early version of an alarm clock designed by Samuel Applegate in Camden, New Jersey. in 1882. Now, this alarm clock was designed to cause physical pain, and it even states that in the patent notes. Samuel Applegate believed that physical pain was more effective at waking someone than by using the standard pendulum chiming clocks at the time. Now, how exactly did this clock work? Well, I have an animation here to show you. At a specified time, a spindle inside the clock released a hook. Attached to the hook was a metal frame holding 60 wooden blocks. When the hook released, the metal frame came crashing down onto the sleeper's face, waking them ever so gently. I'm sure it wasn't very gently. But it is unknown if Samuel Applegate ever tried this on himself before applying for a patent. But I can assure you that this alarm clock was never manufactured. No one ever had the opportunity to smash themselves in the face with it. This is a photo of the area of downtown Los Angeles today. What did this area look like in 1886? Let's take a look. Pretty bare. A few homes sporadically placed, a few stores here and there. Definitely no indication of the entertainment capital of the world Los Angeles would one day become. Now, I normally only present American history. That just happens to be my area of interest in this time period. But on rare occasions, I will present something from another country if I can tie it into something with America. And as film and movies are popular in today's entertainment and American pop culture, I thought this would be appropriate to share. This is the earliest footage known to exist. It's titled Round Hay Garden Scene. It was filmed in Yorkshire, England on October 14th, 1888. Now, the actors, quote-unquote actors, in this footage were instructed to walk around and or laugh to themselves. And I have this looped a few times. It's only about 2 or 3 seconds long. Now, as you can see, I'll play it again. The actors, some are walking around, some are just turning. There's a woman in the back kind of bouncing back and forth. Perhaps she's laughing, but this is considered the earliest footage known to exist. Let's take a look at this happy-looking family. Not sure how happy they are. No one is smiling, which I will get into later in this program of why people didn't smile, and it's not for the reason most people have heard. This is an early example of photo editing. As you can see, there are 8 people in this photo. However, when this photo was taken, only 6 were present. Can you spot the 2 who were not present for this photo? I'll give you a few seconds to do that. It is, in fact, the 2 men in back. They were not present when this photo was taken. The photographer took photos of the men at separate times and then included them into the photo. Now, not every photographer excelled at this type of photo editing, and there are some bad examples of photo edits of this time. But this photographer did excel at it, and this is just one of many examples of early photo editing. Speaking of photos, these photos may seem a bit creepy to us today, but this was very common for the time period. Have you ever watched a professional photographer try to get an infant or young child to sit still for a photo? It's almost impossible. Well, children of the 19th century were no different. They would not sit still. So, many times, photographers would have their assistants sit in a chair and hold the child steady. Now, because the assistant is obviously not the child's mother, the assistant should not be seen. So, she was often covered with a drape, as seen in these photos, which make these examples creepy to us today, even though it was very common for the time period. People of the 19th century were very superstitious, and I guarantee no matter how superstitious any of you watching this program are, you are nowhere near as superstitious as people were in the 19th century. Let's take a look at some of these superstitions. If several deaths occur in the same family, tie a black ribbon to everything alive that enters the house, even animals. This will protect against death spreading further. And it gets stranger from here. If a firefly gets into your house, someone will soon die. If you smell roses when none are around, someone is going to die. If you see an owl in the daytime, there will be a death. If a bird pecks on your window or crashes into one, there has been a death. If a sparrow flies in through a window and lands on a piano, someone in the home will die. How specific is that? If a picture falls off the wall, there will be a death of someone you know. Dropping an umbrella on the floor or opening one in the house means there will be a murder in the house. Now, to those who are superstitious today, opening an umbrella indoors means general bad luck. But in the 19th century, it also meant a murder could possibly occur. Stop the clock at the time of someone's passing in order to avoid your own untimely death. And the last one, which doesn't necessarily have to do with death, but I found interesting enough to share anyway. A dog howling at night when someone in the house is sick is a bad omen. It can be reversed by reaching under the bed and turning over a shoe. Just turn over a shoe and you will be safe. These four gentlemen are a part of a barbershop quartet. Barbershop was a very popular form of music in the late 19th century. Now, as these four sing a part of Sweet Adeline for you, which was written in 1904, I want you to imagine screams of pain in the background. I know that's a strange request, but as they're singing a part of Sweet Adeline for you, I'd like you to imagine screams of pain, and I will explain why afterward. The flower of my heart, sweet Adeline, So did anyone just listening to this imagine screams of pain? Were you able to hear them? Or let me rephrase the question. Were you distracted by the singing in order to hear or imagine the screams of pain? If you were distracted by the singing, then barbershop did exactly what it was intended to do. Barbershop dates back to the 1700s, when barbers not only provided haircuts and shaves, but performed minor surgeries as well, most commonly tooth extractions. Now, as there wasn't any Novocaine at this time, a tooth extraction was rather painful, which resulted in the patient screaming, and barbers were afraid that this would drive away potential business from people passing by their shops hearing screams of pain coming from within. So on days when a tooth extraction was scheduled, barbers would hire groups of men to stand out in front of their shop and sing as loud as they could. The men selected songs, and they may not have been in perfect tune with these four, but they did sing together as loud as possible, and it worked. People passing by the shop focused on the singing and not on the screams of pain coming from within. As this style of music became popular in the late 19th century, it became known as barbershop because of where the style of music originated, which is actually documented in front of barbershops. Before there was Chatty Cathy, Teddy Ruxpin, Tickle Me Elmo, or any other talking doll, there was the Edison phonograph doll, released in the spring of 1890. Now, Thomas Edison was a very successful inventor, but there is one area he was not so successful in, and that was making toys. Edison tried applying the phonograph technology he perfected with dolls. Now, in theory, on paper, this should have been groundbreaking. Nothing had ever been done like this. No doll or toy of any kind had ever spoken. But this doll was a complete failure. Why? Well, first, let's take a look at how the doll worked. So women who worked in Edison's New Jersey studio would recite one of a number of nursery rhymes onto miniature wax discs, and those discs would be in turn inserted into miniature phonographs, which would be inserted into the doll's back. A crank sticking at the back had to be continuously cranked in order to keep the doll talking. Again, groundbreaking. Nothing had ever been done like this. So why did the doll fail so bad? Maybe it's because of the way the doll sounded. Now, there are a number of these dolls in existence today. Most are in museums. Unfortunately, most are missing the wax discs, which broke easily during shipment to customers in 1890 and just weren't made to last for decades and decades. So for that reason, unfortunately, it's very difficult to find any audio of these dolls. Lucky for you all, I found some. You're going to hear 4 of these nursery rhymes that these dolls recited. Let's hear why these dolls failed. Is anyone's hair standing up on the back of their neck right now? As I mentioned, this doll failed for 2 reasons. One, the wax discs broke easily during shipment to customers in 1890, making the doll for its intended purpose useless to those who received it. Secondly, as you may be able to tell, children were absolutely terrified of this doll. Parents wouldn't buy it for their children after hearing such negative reviews from other parents who bought it for theirs. Now, I mentioned the doll came out in the spring of 1890. It was only available for just a few short months. That was it. Nobody was buying this thing. A few short months and this doll was no longer available for sale. The phonograph doll is considered Thomas Edison's greatest failed invention. But really, it wasn't a failed invention. It worked exactly as it was supposed to, as long as the wax disc stayed intact. It's just people were not ready for this type of technology at the time. Many of you may recognize this young man. It is a young Samuel Clemens, better known to us as Mark Twain. How did Samuel Clemens obtain the pen name Mark Twain? Well, the common story is that while he was a young riverboat pilot in between newspaper writing assignments, he adopted the nautical term Mark Twain as his pen name. Now, in nautical terms, 6 feet of water is referred to as a fathom. Therefore, 12 feet of water is 2 fathoms. 2 fathoms is also referred to as twain. And 2 feet of water, or twain, would have to be measured in order to ensure safe passage of riverboats. So it wasn't uncommon for a riverboat pilot or captain to shout Mark Twain, meaning to mark or measure 12 feet of water in order to ensure safe passage of riverboats. So is that how Samuel Clemens obtained that pen name? Not exactly. At the time Samuel Clemens was a young riverboat pilot, there was another riverboat pilot who was also a writer. His name was Isaiah Sellers, and he was the one who adopted the nautical term Mark Twain as his pen name. So how did Samuel Clemens end up with it? Well, he was asked that later in his life, and his reply was, and I quote, "He, meaning Isaiah Sellers, died in 1864, and as he could no longer need that signature, I laid violent hands upon it without asking permission of the proprietor's remains." It's a fancy way of saying he stole the pen name from Isaiah Sellers, and that is how Samuel Clemens became the Mark Twain we know today. Now, I explained earlier in the program of why people didn't smile in early photos. There are 2 theories today as to why that is. The first theory is because it took so long for a photo to be taken, people couldn't hold a smile for that long. Well, by the 1850s, a photo could be taken within 10 seconds. So although 10 seconds may seem like a bit of a long time to hold a smile, it wasn't impossible. So that theory really holds no weight. The second theory is due to lack of dental hygiene, people didn't have the nicest teeth and therefore didn't want them seen. There is no documentation to back that up. So that theory holds no weight. So why didn't people smile in early photos? For the likely answer, we have to go back to the 18th century, when prior to photographic portraits, portraits were painted. Now those most often appearing as smiling in painted portraits are fools and drunks. Now if you didn't own a personal camera like the Brownie cameras you saw earlier in this program, if you had to go to a professional photography studio to get your photo taken, that could be expensive. Not everybody could afford that. And those who could maybe only afford one in a lifetime, and they didn't want that photo representing them as a fool or a drunk. In fact, Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, who is known for really never smiling in photos, once stated, "A photograph is the most important document, and there is nothing more damning to go down to posterity than a silly, foolish smile caught and fixed forever." So that, for reasons of posterity, is likely why people didn't smile in early photos. How many of you have either seen or owned these types of candle holders? These types of candle holders date back to the 1600s. In the 1800s, they became known as courting candles, and that is because they were used as the head of the household, which was usually the husband/father, as a timer for suitors to come over and visit his daughter. With the courting candle, the top spiral of the candle was used as a timer itself. When the candle burned down to that top spiral, it was time for that suitor to leave, the visit was over. So for the sake of this demonstration, it is the 19th century and I'm a father with an adult daughter living with me, and she's having a suitor come over to visit. Maybe there's some things about this guy I don't approve of, I don't want my daughter dating him, or really him spending any amount of time in my home. Keeping in mind, the top spiral is its timer itself, I'm going to lower this candle to a very low spiral. That's how much time that suitor has to visit my daughter. That's not a lot of time. Now let's say my daughter's having her suitor over who I do like, I approve of him, I think he's good for her. I'm going to raise this candle to a higher spiral. Now look how much time that suitor has to visit. A lot more than the last guy. Now as head of the household, I can extinguish this candle at any time if I feel this visit needs to end early, or if the candle is naturally extinguished, I can replace it with another, leave the two alone, and again when it burns down to that top spiral, it is time for that suitor to leave, the visit is over. And that is the courting candle. This film you're about to see is 45 seconds long and it's titled The X-ray Fiend. It was filmed in 1897 and it demonstrates the early use of splicing footage to create some of the earliest special effects. So without further ado, I give to you The X-ray Fiend from 1897. Those special effects would likely not win any Academy Awards today, but that was high tech for the time. In 1899, a man from Battle Creek, Michigan named Uriah Smith designed this concept vehicle he called the Horsey Horseless. Uriah Smith wasn't entirely sure that people were ready to get rid of horses altogether as a mode of transportation in exchange for gas-powered vehicles, so he added a wooden horse's head to the front of his vehicle. The horse's head was hollow to hold gasoline. Now this patent that you see is as far as this concept got. It was considered an immediate flop. It was never manufactured, just an interesting idea on paper. In 1903, an illustrator from Collier Weekly designed this concept of what he thought New York City, Manhattan, would look like 100 years later in 2003. As you can see, it looks very different than we know Manhattan to look today. Now, there is a caption beneath the photo which you're not able to see, but the caption speaks of people being able to travel across multiple states over a short period of time by way of quote-unquote airships, which would take off and land on quote-unquote flying machine landing stages. So, very interesting terminology and image at a time prior to the Wright brothers having their first flight. This ad that you see is considered the very first ad for a radio. It's not a radio as we know it today, rather it's a wireless telegraph, but still it is considered the first ad for a radio. This ad appeared in the November 25th, 1905 publication of Scientific American, which was a national publication headquartered in New York City. Now, when New York City residents saw this ad, a number of them contacted the New York City Police Department to conduct an investigation into the company you see here, Electro Importing Company. Why? Because of the price you see in the ad, $8.50. Now, this was no small amount of money back in the day, but people felt for this type of technology that you could now own in your home, it should be a lot more expensive. So people were naturally weary of this ad, thinking it a scam. The New York City Police Department received so many complaints and inquiries to investigate that an investigator or a police officer was sent over to the company and determined that the company and an ad were legitimate. So the first ad for a radio caused a bit of controversy. One of the worst natural disasters in American history was the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and resulting fires. Now, this footage is going to go on for 3 minutes, and as it does, I'm going to rattle off some information. Both pieces of this footage were shot by two brothers who owned and operated a movie studio. They would go from city to city, securing movie cameras to the front of trolleys, which would then go down these main roads and give people around the country glimpses into city life, into these specific cities, which people may never otherwise get to see in person. Now, the before footage was captured or filmed April 14th, 1906, just 4 days prior to the earthquake occurring. Not one person in this footage had any idea what was about to occur. The street that you're looking down is Market Street. It's one of the hardest hit streets in terms of fire, which I'll explain shortly. But after filming this footage, the brothers packed up and headed to New York City to record the same kind of footage there. While in New York City, they got word of the San Francisco earthquake and fires and quickly packed up their equipment and headed back west, where they shot the after footage. Now, I was able to sync the before and after footage up perfectly, so all the buildings you see, all the structures you see in the before footage should all be in the after footage, and they're gone, reduced to rubble. Now, as I mentioned, this is Market Street, one of the hardest hit streets in terms of fire. One of the largest fires on the street was started by a woman who was making breakfast for her children. She didn't realize that the earthquake had collapsed a part of her chimney, so there was no way for the smoke or the heat to escape, and her kitchen ignited on fire, which ignited the rest of the house on fire and carried over to the buildings next to it. It's known as the ham and eggs fire. Now, in the after footage, you'll see a sign appearing that says General Arthur. You can just barely make out the letter G in general in the before footage. That whole large building covering that sign completely reduced to rubble. Now, when this after footage was recorded, it was sent away for safekeeping, and whoever they sent it to lost it. It was thought to be lost forever, unfortunately. It was recently just found in 2014 in someone's attic, which is why the quality doesn't seem so preserved as compared to the before footage, because it wasn't as well preserved. But that's a very good side-by-side comparison of just how destructive this earthquake and fire were to San Francisco, and this was just one of many streets in San Francisco to resemble this. Here is a phonograph, or gramophone. The terms are interchangeable today. If you've ever heard one of these, they are very loud. And if you owned one back in the day and you lived in a very small house, how would you control the volume? That volume could be overwhelming, and there was no volume control.
So how did people muffle the volume of these early phonographs where there was no volume control? I have here a phonograph horn and a sock, and perhaps you can tell what's about to occur. People would roll up the sock, stuff it inside the horn, and that successfully muffled the audio. And I can attest, I tried it at home, and it works. It's also where we get the phrase, put a sock in it, meaning to be quiet or stay muffled. And that's where that phrase comes from, back in the 19th century.
Let's wrap up this program with some Titanic information. Now here are the 8 musicians who played aboard Titanic who went down with the ship, playing right to the very end. White Star Line required all their musicians, not just the ones aboard Titanic, but aboard all their ships, to memorize every song in the White Star Line songbook. Now, White Star Line songbooks were handed to first-class passengers only, and in them appeared 352 songs. All White Star Line employees aboard all their ships were required to memorize 352 songs. This is because White Star Line didn't want their musicians looking sloppy, shuffling through sheet music. If a passenger should approach them and request a song, they had to know how to play that song immediately. So imagine 352 songs. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think of it. In a race to break the news first about Titanic sinking, not every newspaper had all the facts, and some printed that all passengers aboard Titanic were safe, and even that Titanic herself was safe. And here are some examples. Titanic sinking, no lives lost. Passengers transferred to Carpathia, all are now safe. Titanic's passengers taken off in mid-ocean without loss of a life. Titanic sinking, but probably no lives will be lost. Can you imagine if social media were around at that time, how hard they would rip into these newspapers for printing what we now know as fake news? Here is author Morgan Robertson. In 1898, Robertson wrote a book titled Futility or the Wreck of the Titan. It was a fictional story about a passenger steamship which struck an iceberg and sank. Did Morgan Robertson predict the sinking of the Titanic 14 years before the tragedy actually occurred? Let's take a look at some similarities between the fictional Titan and Titanic. The first similarity right off the bat is the names of the ships, Titan and Titanic. But aside from those, Titan was a triple-screw propeller ship. So was the Titanic. Titan was said to be unsinkable. So was Titanic. Titan was 800 feet long and weighed 45,000 tons. Titanic was 882 feet long and weighed 46,000 tons, not far off. Titan struck an iceberg on the starboard side on an April night in the North Atlantic. Titanic struck an iceberg on the starboard side on April 14th in the North Atlantic. Very close in date. Titan was traveling at 25 knots at the time of collision. Titanic was traveling at 22.5 knots at the time of collision. Titan had a shortage of lifeboats. So did Titanic. More than half of the 2,500 passengers perished aboard Titan. More than half of the 2,200 passengers aboard Titanic perished. What do you think of those similarities? Well, following the Titanic disaster, people credited Morgan Robertson with being clairvoyant, but he denied this, claiming the similarities can be explained by his extensive knowledge of shipbuilding and maritime trends. Now, there's another theory that Titanic was modeled after Titan, due to the similarities in its measurements. Even if that were the case, how would you explain the similarities of what happened to Titanic, where it happened, and how it happened? So that is some food for thought. And ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of this program. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed giving it. And I thank the Adams County Historical Society again for allowing me to present this Victorian Historian program to you today or tonight, whenever you happen to be viewing it. Thank you.